Many times we take everyday objects for granted. Of course, there's the stuff like coffee cups and car keys, but when's the last time you thought consciously about a ruler or a paperclip? In a pinch, you might just need to rely on something totally unexpected. Necessity is the mother of all invention, so they say. Here are 3 stories about an unlikely hero stopping what surely would have been a disaster. Real quick though, if you're enjoying these stories, please consider subscribing or leaving a like or a comment. Also, if you want to nominate another mundane object to be the protagonist of a new set of stories, just let me know in the comments. Now, without further ado, let's get to the stories. Story 1. You ever wonder how fate helps people out when they really need it? That was my experience a few years ago. It turns out I needed a specific object at a certain time, and how or why it was placed in my path, I have no idea. However, if I hadn't had this item, who knows what would have happened to me. To set the scene, I was a sophomore in high school. We lived not too far from the school, so I'd usually walk back instead of taking the bus. There was also a small shopping center near the route I'd take, so I'd frequently stop there to either get a snack, hang out with friends, or set up in the coffee shop to start working on my homework. That's what I decided to do on this particular day, as I had an essay due in a few days. My last class was chemistry, and I needed to stay behind and talk to our teacher, who I'll call Mrs. C. I'd been absent for a few days, and needed to make up a test. Mrs. C, who was a bit on the older side but really sweet, went over to her desk and checked her schedule, which she still kept on paper. Setting up the time for the makeup test took like 5 or 10 minutes, so when I finally left her classroom, the hallways were starting to become empty. Our high school wasn't the biggest, but my locker was on the other side of it, and when I got there, I talked with some of my friends. By the time I walked back over to the exit closest to my route, the hallways were deserted. I walked outside onto the large sidewalk by where the buses leave, and then I looked around and saw an object. At first I wasn't sure what it was, so I went over to it. It was one of those rubber wedge-shaped doorstops. I decided to try to put it back inside the school, but the doors had locked behind me, and I didn't see anyone still inside. Now, here is where I think fate intervened. In hindsight, it would have been so easy for me to just put the doorstop near one of the doors, or even just leave it where it was. But for some reason that's still beyond me, I picked it up and put it in my backpack. Don't ask me why. After I did that, I continued to walk to the shopping center, which was several blocks away. Now our school isn't in a rural area by any means, but it is in a relatively quiet side of town. Some of the buildings here border crop fields, and not all of the roads have sidewalks next to them. I was about halfway to the shopping center when I noticed a car following behind me. It was an old beater of a car, with rust and duct tape holding on one of the panels. I think I somehow knew their intentions weren't good the moment I realized it was back there. Unfortunately, there wasn't any store nearby that I could just walk into, as this side of the road just had a cornfield by it. I contemplated my options and decided to hurry up my pace. My heart sank when I heard the car get closer, and then when I heard the window roll down and someone asked me if I needed a ride. I turned around to see some greasy-haired guy in his 30s who I didn't know. I politely told him no thank you and turned back around. While it's true that I had been offered a ride before, that was only from one of my friends or parents of other students. Somehow I knew that that man wasn't anyone's parent. I was praying that the man would just drive off and leave me, but to my horror, he pulled up even closer behind. The front of his car was literally like 5 feet away from me. "It's really no problem," he said, as I tried not to turn around. He just wouldn't quit, and a moment later his window was now directly across from me. I promise I'm not scary. As if that last comment was supposed to put me at ease somehow. Adrenaline pumping through my veins, I turned and looked right at the man and told him to leave me alone. He made some kind of gesture like he was wiping a tear from his eye, and I shouted it louder. Finally, the man rolled up his window and sped off. At that moment, the shopping center came into view, and it was like a 1,000-pound weight was lifted off my shoulders. I wasted no time getting into the coffee shop, and after I ordered a beverage and snack, I took a seat at one of the tables. Now, this might have been a mistake, but I sat near one of the windows. My logic was that I'd be able to see that creep if he parked nearby, or, God forbid, walked into the coffee shop too. I was relieved when he did not. I took my laptop out of my backpack and worked on my essay for around 2 hours. periodically looking up to see if that man was there. He never came, or at least, I never saw him. Then I had to make another decision, and the one I made was the most boneheaded of my life. I thought about calling my parents, who would happily have come to get me, but they probably would have asked why I wanted a ride, as our house was only 2 blocks away. Then I'd have to explain about the man, or make up an excuse, and for whatever reason I didn't want to have to do that. So instead, I walked out of the coffee shop, did one last 360, then started walking home. I can't tell you the magnitude of regret I felt when I heard a car slow down behind me as I was on the sidewalk leading into our neighborhood. Without turning, I knew it was him, and I also knew he probably meant business this time. Before I had a chance to turn, he pulled right up beside me again and rolled down the window. The man told me I must be tired, so I should let him give me a ride. He also said he'd seen me doing homework, and that good students such as myself deserved to be given rides. I guess the man did see me at the coffee shop, and as if this guy couldn't make things any more creepy. At first I tried to ignore him, but as he continued the discussion, I stopped walking, turned directly to face him, and screamed at him to F off. Then his expression changed from the disgusting smile he had been wearing before to a genuine look of hatred. He stopped the car, and I heard him open his door. Without thinking, I swung my backpack around my arm, unzipped it, grabbed the rubber doorstop, and held it behind my back. A second later, the man walked onto the sidewalk and approached me menacingly. My life was flashing before my eyes as I let him come closer. I figured that throwing the doorstop wouldn't work, but hitting him with it might. When he reached out to grab me, I swung with all my might and landed one heavy blow to his face. The man let out a scream and fell sideways onto the sidewalk. I kicked him as hard as I could, and he curled up in pain. Seeing him most likely disabled, I took off running. I made it back to my house, and when my parents saw me come in out of breath, they were immediately concerned. I told them what happened, and my mom became hysterical. My dad went to get his gun, but my mom pleaded with him to wait as she called 911. In all the commotion, I realized I hadn't gotten the license plate number, but miraculously, the man was still by his car when the police showed up 10 minutes later. I guess I really knocked him out. To no one's surprise, the man had a prior criminal history, and he ended up in jail after this happened. For a while, my parents insisted that I either take the bus or get a ride home from friends. None of my close friends actually lived in my neighborhood, so I usually ended up taking the bus, which wasn't so bad. In fact, after what happened, it seemed like a dream come true. Anyway, I still think about this experience from time to time, including why I decided to pick up that doorstop in the first place. I'll never know, but I will always be grateful. Story 2. This happened to me when I was in the 5th grade, and it is hands down the most terrifying experience of my life so far. For context, we were making mobiles for art class. You know, those sculpture type thingies with stuff hanging down and balancing. Our teacher, Mrs. Bronson, would always encourage us to be really creative. In every other class I was a procrastinator, and I don't consider myself to be an artist really. But there was just something about her, in her class, that made me want to go the extra mile. For the mobiles, we were supposed to use everyday objects, and were only expected to find a few things around our house, like pencils and crayons, and bits of construction paper. But I decided to have my mom take me to several stores to look for other things I could use. I was thinking I'd get most of what I needed at a Michael's Arts and Crafts store, but first my mom had other errands to run. Long story short, at around 6 p.m. we arrived at an office store. I won't say the name here, but it was your typical major chain office store. I think my mom had to get some folders and printer paper for work, but I'm not sure. Anyway, I was left to explore the store on my own for a while, and while walking down one of the aisles, I came to where the doorstops were. There was actually a decent selection, and I decided it might be cool to get a few different types. To be clear, I did still want to use a lot of other items from Michael's. While picking out a few of the doorstops, I jumped as someone spoke from directly behind me. I had no idea anyone was there. I turned my head to see an older lady, maybe in her 50s, wearing a ripped t-shirt and blue jeans. She was very skinny and her face looked sunken in. Combined with her odor, I immediately figured that she was homeless and/or had been using drugs. She had just asked me if I knew where the restroom was, and when my gaze met hers, I shrugged my shoulders and made kind of a grunting sound. She said thank you in an unusual, quick, loud way and turned and walked away. Needless to say, I was completely weirded out, finished grabbing the doorstops, and walked away in the other direction to try to find my mom. She was in one of the other aisles, and when I saw her, I told her there was a creepy lady in the store. I don't think she realized just how creepy, because she said something like, "Don't worry, we're about to leave." Now maybe it was because that old lady mentioned the bathroom, but I realized I had to go pretty bad. The soda I drank in the car probably had something to do with it. We were near the back of the store, and I could see the sign pointing to the bathrooms. After a moment of thought, I decided that the risk was minimal, and I told my mom that's where I was going. One incredibly important detail is that I was holding onto the doorstops, as my mom hadn't actually gotten a basket or a shopping cart. When I got to the back hallway with the bathrooms, I realized that they were single-use. I opened the door to one of them slowly, and made sure to open the door all the way and check to make sure that woman wasn't in there. She wasn't, so I stepped inside and then locked the door. I'll spare the details, but a minute later I was finished and washing my hands. I remember I was just waving my hand in front of the paper towel dispenser when I heard an extremely loud thud on the door. It caught me completely off guard, but before I could figure out what was causing it, there was another thud. The door was actually bowing inwards, and I heard the locking mechanism clink. A moment later I heard yelling outside, and I realized it was that same lady who I encountered earlier. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but the thuds were coming faster, and to my complete horror, I heard the sound of metal snapping and then scraping. The only word that comes to mind is miracle, when I realized I still had the doorstops, and started lining them up in front of the door in anticipation of it breaking open. There were 4 in total, all different sizes, and I figured that at least one of them had to catch the door. Thank God I was right, because a moment later the door finally gave way and that lady's screaming got a lot louder. I was bracing the doorstops with one of my feet as I leaned against the sink for support. I think 2 of the doorstops caught the door as it flung open, and though they budged a few inches, it wasn't enough for that lady to get through. I heard other voices from outside as several employees were trying to talk her down. Then there was a scuffle, and it seemed like the lady had been tackled. A few seconds later, I heard my mom screaming that her son was in the bathroom and to let her through. I cautiously peeked through the crack and saw the lady pinned against the wall by 3 employees further down the hall. My mom started knocking on the door to the first bathroom, and when I removed the doorstops and walked outside, she ran over and threw her arms around me. There's not much more to the story. The cop showed up a few minutes later and took the lady away in cuffs. The manager on duty came over and apologized to all the customers, and we actually ended up not having to pay for anything we were about to buy. I told my friends about what happened the next day, and they joked about how I should keep those doorstops with me for life. I didn't actually do that, but rather use them to make them mobile as I intended. I still think about what happened in the store, maybe daily, and to this day I thank God that the items I picked out happened to be doorstops. Story 3. The story takes place when I was in the 3rd grade, which sadly is several decades ago at this point. Even at that time, our building was relatively old, and it seemed to have been built with the philosophy of having everything be open, so that people could come and go as they please. Therefore, there hadn't been any doors on any of the classrooms. There were immediately a couple downsides, including sound coming in from the hallways in other classrooms, and kids sneaking out without hall or bathroom passes. At some point while I was there, I think the teachers finally got fed up with it and forced the administration to finally install doors. There was a 2-week stretch when the new doors were being installed but didn't yet have handles or locks put in them. I know that sounds strange, and I bet money that some incompetent staff member or contractor had ordered the wrong part. Anyway, there was a hole where the handle and locking mechanism was supposed to be, and me and my classmates would look at each other from opposite sides and joke around. Our teacher, Mrs. Blinn, was definitely on the stricter side and didn't appreciate us playing around her door either before or after class. After a few days, she actually got one of those rubber doorstops and started blocking the door until right before class started, and we'd all have to wait outside until she decided to open the door. On one Tuesday afternoon, we all started to file in after Mrs. Blinn opened the door. This was right after lunch and recess, so we were all a little distracted. Mrs. Blinn reminded us to get to our seats, and then told us we'd be watching an educational video about the water cycle. As any kid will tell you, that was music to our ears, and we started cheering. Mrs. Blinn shushed us, then told us that if we continued to be loud, we'd have to work on worksheets quietly and independently. We stopped talking rather quickly, as Mrs. Blinn moved the TV on the rolling cart from the back of the room to the front. Apparently there was a problem, as the VCR didn't seem to want to play the tape. After a few moments of troubleshooting, Mrs. Blinn cautioned us to be on our best behavior as she left to go somewhere, presumably to get another VCR player. Now we didn't all immediately start talking, since Mrs. Blinn was known to peek back in quickly after leaving a room, or asking someone else to stop by and look in at us. But a few of the kids did start talking, myself included, and I actually got out of my seat and walked over to my friend Kevin's desk. I forgot exactly what we were talking about, but the room fell silent when we heard 3 loud bangs coming from somewhere else in the building. A moment later, we heard screams and what sounded like doors slamming. Then we heard what sounded like a crazed lunatic yelling incomprehensible words. The girls in my class started crying, and none of us knew what to do in such a situation. I think this was way before formal lockdowns and other emergency procedures were a thing. And as the school didn't have any police officers or security guards on campus, we were essentially sitting ducks. To our horror, the yelling started getting closer, and we also heard thumps interspersed between louder bangs. Next thing we know, the PA system activated, and we heard the principal tell everyone to exit the building if they were able to, or to barricade the doors if there wasn't a way out. Obviously, there was no way to lock the doors. Kevin and I and 2 other boys started pushing desks up against the door, and thank God Kevin spotted the rubber doorstop and shoved that under the door too. A moment later, the thumps were right by the wall next to our door, and the yelling was much louder. It was still completely incomprehensible. Now the thumps were on our door, and we could see it bulge out every time the man hit it. He actually lowered his face to shout right through the opening where the handle should have been, and that was the most terrifying moment of my life. This went on for a good 30 seconds before the man apparently gave up and left. The thumps started getting softer before we heard a door to the outside open, and then the yelling abruptly stopped. My classmates and I just sat there, looking at each other. Some of the girls were still crying and I was still in shock myself. A minute or 2 later, we heard a knocking at our door and heard Mrs. Blinn's voice. She sounded frantic and asked us to let her in. I removed the doorstop and she quickly came inside. Mrs. Blinn ordered us to re-barricade the door while we waited for the cops to arrive. We did that, and 5 minutes later we heard the police announce their presence and start heading to each of the classrooms. When we could finally come outside, we saw what had been making those loud bangs. Contrary to our hypothesis, they weren't gunshots. Rather, the man had tipped over some of the bookshelves in the little library area in the middle of our building. I should mention that man was never caught, nor even identified, at least to the best of my knowledge. School was obviously canceled for the rest of the day, and parents were required to come and pick up their children. For about 2 weeks afterwards, there were always at least 2 cops on campus, and the door handles and locks were also installed. Nothing even remotely scary happened for the rest of my academic career, and I'm just thankful for that. I'm also eternally grateful to my friend Kevin, who had the foresight to use the doorstop, because if the door hadn't stayed closed, who knows what that man would have done to us.